Hello, Professor Christopher Zaslawski.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Tae-Hyung Lee from KMCRIC in Kyung University, and we are trying. So today I'll give you some questions based on your presentation today.
Sure.
So first one is, so clinical studies or acupuncture studies using pattern identification have made considerable improvement in standardization of traditional medicine. And please tell us the implications of your presentation today.
I think pattern identification is a very important component of traditional East Asian medicine. It's necessary to improve the reliability, and I think the only way we can do that is through standardising the patterns. At this point in time, there have been several groups that have tried to put forward particular standards. But it's quite difficult to do so because we're talking about something that's very subjective, that in a sense can't be measured, so it can be quite difficult. The area that has been shown to have some type of potential is to identify some biomarkers for particular patterns, so that may be a surrogate measure of a particular pattern.
Thank you. So I think it will be better.
Yeah.
If you stay here because it is more closer.
Yes, okay.
To your car. So because we are making cut.
Yeah.
So here goes the second question. So you have used pattern identification in your clinical researches, and adjusting traditional East Asian medicine system to clinical studies seems quite challenging. And could you tell us difficulty during this attempt?
Yeah, I was involved in a study that, a very small study, a pilot study, to look at whether patterns can be used as an outcome measure. So we actually measured the expression of a pattern or patterns of a particular individual. We gave them an intervention, and then we assessed those patterns again. In some cases we found that the patterns did change, but in some cases they may have stayed the same. So I think it was quite an interesting way to think about patterns, because if they are used as a diagnostic type of measure, maybe they can be used as an outcome approach as well. Yeah.
So, the third question.
Yeah.
So, did you have any difficulty in reflecting real-world clinical situation when you apply pattern identification in your clinical studies? Could pattern identification fully reflect real-world situation?
That's a good question. I think it's difficult. While we have tried to improve the validity of a model validity of using Oriental medicine or traditional East Asian medicine in a research study, it still isn't exactly the same as what happens in clinic. There still is some gap. So while it is an improvement by introducing these particular types of design approaches, which align more with the team approach, or the traditional East Asian medicine approach, there still is something that's not exactly like real life. And I don't know whether we'll be ever able to manage that gap. So definitely we're decreasing the gap, but whether we can actually, clinical trials can mimic real life, I think that would be very difficult.
And because today you mentioned about traditional Chinese medicine, in Korea there is some opinions that TCM is evolved in 1950s. So Chinese medicine before 20th century could be quite different with Chinese medicine which is done these days. So
that's correct. I mean, if we look historically, we find that the type of education that's involved, primarily in China, what we call the TCM model, is a development from previous historical approaches. That's not to say it's not correct, because I think it is a movement towards, it is a progression towards modernisation, but we just have to be aware of that. You're right that historically there were many diverse approaches to doing diagnosis. But in the 1930s to 50s they did systematise it to a certain extent. So I think we have to keep on refining that model. And that's part of the process that's happening now, trying to fit biomarkers, looking at the reliability, improving the reliability. I think that's part of progression towards a more standardised approach and modernisation of traditional East Asian medicines.
Okay, because there's another question. So there would be some differences between standardized pattern identification today and traditional pattern identification, which is done before 20th century. So with this gap, how could we deal with this problem if there would be clinical significance in traditional pattern identification in ancient times? How could we modify this point?
I don't know whether we can ever go back to the mindset that existed at that particular time. As individuals in the modern era, we automatically come with a lot of modern thinking, modern ways we think about things. I don't know whether we can ever go back to that particular mode of thinking because we're influenced too strongly by technology, by modern living, by different science has moved on and shown us things. So it's very difficult to step back in that old framework. People do try and attempt to do that, but I think we have to see it as a progression forward. I hope it's a good progression forward, but at this point we don't know. But I don't think we've got much choice. We have to move forward, we have to modernise, and to a certain extent we have to standardise.
And the most key concept is about the real world. Is that right?
That is important. We've got to try and ensure that the type of research we use aligns itself as closely as possible with what happens in the clinic. But it also has some scientific basis so that we can argue that, that the research does reflect real life. But it is very difficult. They're complex therapies, both herbal medicine and acupuncture. And they're difficult to evaluate because they are complex. They're not like a pill that you can take very quickly and you can blind. It's not as easy as that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.